Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. A very warm welcome to everyone who has joined us today from around the world. My name is Tracy Peterson, and I lead the Holocaust and the United Nations Outreach Program. The outreach program was established by member states of the United Nations in 2005. And we are located within the Department of Global Communications. And we are based at United Nations headquarters in New York, where I'm speaking to you from. A few housekeeping notes. As always, we are recording today's discussion. We record all our discussions, and we will share the recording with you and all of you and with anyone who has registered. We will have a section towards the end of the event for questions and answers. And I would encourage you to place your questions in the Q&A section. And you can do that throughout today's discussion. And towards the end, we will have a little section, as I said, where we can talk about what you've shared with us. And should we not get to answer all the questions because of time, we will make sure to approach our speakers and we will get the answers to you. Today we are joined by esteemed speakers, and it is my pleasure to ask Her Excellency, Ms. Lise Gregoire-van Haaren, who is the permanent representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to the United Nations, to give welcoming remarks. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Tracy, and Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues. It is a great honor for me to join you all here today. And today I will speak about the importance of rights that protect minorities from discrimination and for standing up for justice in solidarity together. And I want to start by thanking the Holocaust and the United Nations Outreach Program for the great collaboration and their invaluable work in mobilizing Holocaust remembrance to prevent future acts of genocide. And I would like to extend special thank you for bringing to life the stories of remarkable Dutch resistance fighters, Willem, Arondeus, and Frieda Belinfante. Their courage in opposing Nazi rule, even in the face of great personal risk, is an inspiration and a reminder of the importance of standing up for justice and human dignity. As we reflect on the story of the Holocaust, remember the immense suffering endured by communities across the world. And in the Netherlands, over 100,000 Jews were murdered, and an astounding 73% of the Dutch Jewish population at the time. And while the persecution of Jews is well known, it is also important to remember the similar persecution of LGBTIQ plus individuals who were targeted for their sexual orientation or gender identity. And this shows that while it may start with discrimination of one minority group, it rarely ends with that. And as the famous quote by Santayana goes, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And the horrors of the Nazi era remind us of the importance of strong legal frameworks and constitutions that protect minorities, such as LGBTIQ plus persons, from discrimination. And it also shows the importance of solidarity amongst minority groups to take collective stand against hatred and violence. In 2001, the Netherlands was the first country that legalized same-sex marriage. And in 2023, we successfully amended our constitution to include sexual orientation and disability under the anti-discrimination clause. At the United Nations, the Netherlands is proud to serve as co-chair of the LGBTI core group, where we work with our partners to promote and protect the rights of LGBTIQ plus individuals worldwide. Our mission is clear: to ensure that no one is left behind in the fight for human dignity and equality. In closing, I would like to express my gratitude for this opportunity to speak today. And I look forward to hearing from our esteemed speakers as we continue to honor the memory of those who suffered and work together towards a more inclusive future. And by standing together, we can ensure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated and the rights of all are respected today and in the future. And we must never forget that solidarity strengthens society. I thank you very much.
Ambassador, thank you very much for your remarks. We appreciate very much your sharing your thoughts with us. I would now like to turn to our first speaker, who is Klaus Mueller, who joins us from Berlin. Klaus is the European representative of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and for many years has served on the US delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Klaus holds a PhD in sociology and is an historian, curator, and filmmaker. He researched and oversaw the inclusion into the USHMM permanent exhibition of materials documenting the Nazi persecution of homosexuals. Klaus interviewed gay survivors for the documentary films Paragraph 175, as well as the documentary But I Was a Girl, which is about Dutch resistance fighter Frieda Belinfante, and served as dramaturgical and historical consultant for the film El Dorado, Everything the Nazis Hate. His exhibitions portraying gay and lesbian survivors have been displayed in the Netherlands, South Africa, and Germany. In 2013, Klaus founded the Salzburg Global LGBT Forum. Today, the forum connects LGBTIQ+ leaders from 76 countries. Welcome, Klaus. We're very pleased to have you with us. And I want to begin with a quick question about terminology. I'm going to be using the UN-approved term LGBTIQ+ throughout. But what terms do we use when we talk about this history?
Tracy, it's great to be here. I'm excited, as you see, and thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it and look forward to our conversation today. And this is a good question to start with. I think every time period forms its own language. So the word homosexual, for example, was coined in German in 1868, and it was used by activists who wanted to stop the criminalization of same-sex relationships. In 1900, the first LGBT human rights organizations started in Germany, and they also adopted the word homosexual for themselves. So of course, as visibility grew, some opponents use it as an insult, a pattern we see throughout history. In recent decades, terms like gay, lesbian, transgender, or now LGBT, queer, LGBTIQ+ have emerged. And different languages, different cultures all develop their own expressions. As a historian talking about Germany, I use both the language of the time and current terms. And in my view, these terms are not meant to be definitive, but they help people reflect and define themselves, both individually and as a group.
Wonderful. Thank you. Can we pause now and could you tell us a little bit about the situation of LGBTIQ+ people in Germany in the first part of the 20th century, before the Nazis came to power in 1933?
Thank you. Sure. So at the end of the 19th century, gay men, lesbian women, transgender people in Germany began to come out and to stand up for their rights. And as I said before, the first LGBT human rights organizations were formed and created in Germany. For example, the Berlin Institute for Sexual Science, the first of its kind in the world, founded in 1919, was groundbreaking in supporting transgender research and rights. And the Institute also led the fight against the criminalization of male homosexuality. Germany was a modern, progressive country in many ways before the Nazis came into power. Berlin, in particular, fostered social changes unthinkable in any other European countries at that time, including a growing acceptance of queer people.
Wow. And what did LGBTIQ+ life look like in the wild late 1920s in Berlin?
Oh, Tracy, it was wild. There were more than 100 catering to lesbians and gays and bisexuals and transgender people, as were many LGBT organizations, publishers, magazines. So queer people became visible The law still discriminated against LGBT people, but as a queer person growing up in the 1920s, you thought, change is possible. I can lead a dignified life. I don't need to hide myself, and I'm part of a growing collective. So that was an awakening.
Wow. So did gay persecution of men only begin in 1933 when the Nazis came to power, or you said the law still discriminated? Please go ahead.
So no, persecution began earlier. In 1871, the law called paragraph 175 made same-sex relationships illegal. However, the judges wanted often to see proof of actual sexual intercourse. So the law led to relatively few sentences, but really opened the society to widespread blackmail. Any public suspicion could have dire consequences. So the fight against paragraph 175 united LGBT organizations and also found increasing support from allies in politics, in the arts, in science, in culture in the late 1920s.
Oh, so that's really interesting. So there was the beginning also of solidarity for the rights in the late 1920s.
Absolutely.
Wow. And so when the Nazis came into power, did they change this legal situation for gay men? And if so, how?
Yes, in 1935, the National Socialists really radicalized paragraph 175. They removed that need for clear proof and used the vague term of sexual offense instead. So under Nazi ideology, homosexuality was no longer just a crime, it was seen as a threat to the German nation. Homo and transphobia were part of the regime's racist plans to control the population in Germany. So the slightest suspicion of homosexual intentions could lead to arrest, a kiss between men, gossip by neighbors, or receiving a letter from a friend. All could be used as evidence. Anything could be considered as a sexual offense.
So are you saying the most basic gesture, being polite, acknowledging somebody, that could be used as evidence?
Yeah, evidence became an incredibly broad concept. Neighbors would report you for suspiciously closing the curtain to your bedroom. A photograph with a note, "Warm regards, your best friend," on the back, that could be considered evidence. Touching your friend's hand in public, evidence. Hearsay, absolutely evidence.
Wow, that's terrifying.
It is
And must have
terrifying.
created such a sense of fear. Wow. But sorry, Klaus,
Indeed.
allow me, I want to back up to something else you mentioned about the
Okay.
Nazi population policy being racist. Could you expand a bit on that?
Sure. So Nazi population policy was based on the ideology that people are divided into different races and that one race is superior to others. The Nazis believed in the superiority of their so-called Germanic master race. And Jews, Roma and Sinti, or Slavic people were seen as inferior, even subhuman. And this racist belief was used to justify their discrimination, their enslavement, and even their mass murder. Homosexuals and people with disabilities were seen as a threat to the German racial health. This racist ideology really shaped every aspect of the Nazi regime and German society.
So the threat was to the so-called racial health. So what was the attitude of the Nazis towards homosexuality?
Really, from the beginning, from the mid-1920s, the Nazi Party had made it very clear that they did not see a place for homosexuals in their future Reich. They believed homosexuality would endanger their number one plan to create a higher birth rate of the so-called Germanic race. So they denounced homosexuality as a sign of degeneration. And Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, called homosexual men asocial elements. He was paranoid of the impact of homosexuality on the purity of the blood of the German race.
Right, this completely fabricated idea of
Don't
purity.
ask me to explain the blood, that's beyond me. But it was really a very deep racism embedded in Nazi Germany.
Right. Do we know how many gay men were prosecuted in Nazi Germany?
Yes, Tracy, we have estimates. So in the 12 years of Nazi rule between 1933 and 1945, over 100,000 men were arrested as so-called homosexuals under paragraph 175. More than 50,000 of these men were sentenced to prison sentence, and 5,000 to 15,000 were deported to concentration camps after finishing their prison sentences. So they were not set free. In the camps, prisoners were marked with different badges, and the homosexual man had to wear a pink triangle. Like all prisoners, they had to do forced labor, but the men with the pink triangle were often isolated by the guards and brutally treated. Some were abused for medical experiments, and some even castrated.
Terrible. Klaus, you've been speaking a lot about how the Nazis treated gay men. Did they treat lesbian women differently?
Yes, in Nazi Germany, a woman's main role was to have children. Lesbian women's lives thus were trapped by state-sponsored homophobia on one side and the glorification of motherhood on the other. German officials debated throughout to extend paragraph 175 to include female same-sex relationships. But many believed that this would be, and I quote from the time, alien to the nature of the German woman. In Austria, however, both male and female homosexuality was punished under the same law. So while the Nazis primarily focused on criminalizing male homosexuality, lesbian women and transgender people were also at risk, of course, of being reported. They lost their social connections and faced constant public judgment. So some lesbians married gay men to protect themselves. There are few documented cases of lesbian women imprisoned in camps solely due to their sexual orientation, but we do know from testimonies from Jewish political prisoners that many lesbian women were incarcerated.
And how did the German police and the Gestapo units identify gay men?
That goes actually quite back. The German police started making lists of men suspected of being homosexual already in the early 1900s. These lists were known as pink lists. They were created from interrogation, surveillance, and denunciations. After 1934, all these pink lists were sent to the Gestapo, the secret state police in Berlin. So people were often reported by neighbors, family, or even strangers, and ended up on these lists.
And so this climate of denunciation, how did that impact this wave of denunciations of neighbors, families, strangers telling on people they thought might be homosexual?
It had an incredible impact for the entire community because everybody needed to position themselves to be very, very careful. After 1935, just being suspected of being homosexual was enough to get someone arrested. If homosexuals were accused, they could lose everything, their jobs, their homes, their honor, their freedom. So why did neighbors, colleagues, or strangers voluntarily report gay men and sometimes lesbian women? The homosexuals no longer knew who to trust in their environment everywhere. In Berlin, half of all investigations between 1933 and 1945 were based on denunciations by private individuals, half. And on top of that, colleagues, employers, and caregivers also could report you and did. I brought you an example of a letter sent to the Gestapo in 1938, and I read you just a little quote. "We have lived in the same house for 12 years, but in all that time, he has never gone out with a girl. Obviously, I cannot say anything for certain, but it strikes me as very suspicious. What are all these young men doing there? But I must ask you not to reveal my name. Signed, Hedwig R. from Berlin-Wilmersdorf." And
that was
and hundreds of these denunciations. They really, in 1935, it was a wave the police hardly knew how to deal with.
It is quite, as you say, and the upshot of it was that people began, who could they trust? In whom, as you have behind you, one of your exhibition posters, in whom can I still trust? And what that must have done to this community that, as you described earlier on, before the Nazis came to power, was beginning to thrive and bloom. I'm wondering, Klaus, how did homo and transphobic persecution and discrimination practiced by the Nazis differ from that, or maybe is similar, of other groups? For example, the persecution and discrimination against Jews, Roma and Sinti, people with disabilities, or political opponents?
There are differences and similarities. So the way many groups were treated as subhuman helped create and certainly fuel the totalitarian nature of Nazi Germany and German society. From the start, Nazi Germany brutally discriminated against Jews in Germany and later in all countries it occupied. So during the Second World War, this policy led to the systematic murder of 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany and its allies and collaborators. In addition to the Holocaust, millions of other people, and you named some of the victim groups, including homosexual people, were persecuted, deported to camps, and often killed. I think all groups of prisoners faced the indifference of society toward their suffering. They were mistreated by the Gestapo and the SS. They dehumanized in the camp system. Homosexual men in prisons and camps were isolated in a specific way. The supportive community no longer existed, and their own families often rejected them, so that they had no one left. If, however, homosexual men were identified as also being Jewish, their Jewish identity determined their fate, which meant often immediate deportation and murder.
And again, to the point that the ambassador was making earlier, all of this was taking place without any legal recourse or any kind of protection. So even if the community no longer supports you, there are no laws that you can look to defend you. And would you say that the homophobia and the transphobia was part of the totalitarian ideology of Nazi Germany? And the second question, how was it used for Nazi propaganda?
So the Nazi state labeled many groups as worthless and even subhuman, and one could say more and more groups the longer they were in power. So anti-Semitism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, the persecution of people with disabilities or of Roma and Sinti became the foundation upon which a racist German society was built. So yes, homo and transphobia were central elements of the totalitarian ideology in Nazi Germany. The Nazis employed propaganda to divide society and promote the belief of racial superiority by marginalizing minority groups. Propaganda framed homosexuality as a threat to the racial purity of the German people. And accusing someone of being homosexual was also a way to discredit them. Everyone knew that few people would defend homosexuals, and the Nazis made use of that.
So it could also be used by the Nazis to silence any form of opposition. If somebody was being problematic, this was another accusation that they could potentially lay against the person and isolate and remove them. Wow.
They did in politics, political opponents, military, the churches. They used it many times.
How did the nature of this persecution change?
Persecution escalated quickly. So after the Nazis changed paragraph 175 in 1935, the police and Gestapo started to target homosexuals systematically. And in 1936, the Reich Central Office for Combating Homosexuality and Abortion was established, directly linking the fight against homosexuality with Nazi population politics. So arrests became routine. In 1940, SS leader Heinrich Himmler ordered that convicted homosexuals would automatically be deported to concentration camps after having finished their sentence in the prison. And each year, stricter measures were added. Even castration was discussed.
So as the atmosphere closes in and becomes increasingly terrifying, what was the response from gay men and lesbians? Did LGBTIQ people, IQ plus people, foresee the radical persecution coming after 1933?
Tracy, this was a community that was just starting to find its way. No one expected that something as simple as address books or private letters could become evidence against them. So if you could have imagined that their country would transform so quickly into a totalitarian state that would eventually become a killing machine. Most other communities did also not foresee such a descent into barbarism and evil. So the exception were those who already had been directly attacked. Many of them went into exile right away to survive, but many others believed or hoped that fascism would not last.
And how did the rest of German society, or to that matter, other countries, react to the persecution of LGBTIQ plus people?
I don't think that many people were concerned about what was happening to homosexual and transgender people in Nazi Germany. Many denunciations coming from neighbors and from inside Germany seem to have been motivated by proving loyalty to the Nazi regime. And in many European countries and the United States, there were also laws discriminating against homosexuals and widespread prejudice. So I researched, for example, whether homosexual men could escape Nazi Germany by going into exile. And one key requirement, as one survivor shared with me, was to be very, very secret about your orientation, your sexual orientation. No one would have given you a visa.
Was there any solidarity with the homosexual prisoners expressed by other prisoner groups?
Unfortunately, no. There was little solidarity with homosexual prisoners. Those marked with a pink triangle were often isolated, and fellow prisoners also avoided them due to their own deep-rooted prejudice. Homosexual prisoners could not support each other, as any contact between them was often punished by the guards. These men were brutalized and often killed. So homosexual prisoners were also assigned often to forced labor groups where they had really little chance of survival. So compared to other smaller victim groups, such as political prisoners or Jehovah's Witnesses, the mortality rate for homosexual men was very high, estimated at 60%.
Wow. Was it possible for gay men and lesbians to resist? Did they?
Yes, some gay men and lesbian women did resist. They joined the resistance, faked identity papers, helped hide Jewish people. Perhaps we can show photos of the 3 resistance fighters I have worked with. Here's the first one. I interviewed Gerd Beck, who you see here after the war in a displaced person camp, about his survival in Berlin. So Gerd was a young Jewish gay man who survived in Nazi Berlin. And he not only survived, he used his gay networks to help himself and other Jewish people. And he barely survived. And of course, and the Excellency, the ambassador from the Netherlands already mentioned Willem Arondeus. In the Netherlands, Willem Arondeus, a gay artist, and Frieda Belinfante, a lesbian conductor. Here you see the young portrait of Frieda. The portrait of Willem was at a later stage in his life. So Frieda Belinfante, a lesbian conductor, and Willem, they led a resistance group that destroyed identity papers in 1943. Frieda was an amazing, remarkable woman. To me, she was a hero.
And you met Frieda at one point, didn't you?
Yes, I met Frieda late in her life, when she was 90 years old and suffering from cancer. But despite her condition, she agreed to share her unknown story with me on video. Frieda was a talented cellist, but more importantly, she became one of the first female conductors in music history in the late 1930s. And she led an unusually open life as a lesbian woman during that time. When the Germans occupied the Netherlands in 1940, she dissolved her orchestra immediately. Many of her musicians were Jewish, and Frieda knew that the Germans would target them. She joined the resistance all by herself and then started to work closely with Willem Arondeus. Together, they forged ID cards, which were crucial for Jews in hiding. And in 1943, their group carried out one of the most daring acts of resistance by attacking the Amsterdam Population Registry, where many of the original ID papers were held, and many of them were destroyed, so making it impossible for the Germans to verify the forgeries of identity papers. Sadly, the group was betrayed, and most of the men were executed, including Willem Arondeus.
And what happened to Frieda? How did she escape?
The Gestapo knew Frieda's identity, so Frieda decided to hide in plain sight. She disguised herself as a man. She wore a suit, and she told me this story in detail, so it was amazing to listen to that story for me. She wore a suit. She had her hair cut short by a hairdresser, and she spoke in a deeper voice. She shared with me that not even her own mother recognized her when she passed the street. But she knew that her presence eventually would put others in danger. She fled to Paris all by herself and then crossed the border from occupied France to neutral Switzerland. It was in the winter of 1944, snow and ice everywhere. I visited the place once. It's really hard to imagine. She waded through an icy river to escape.
Wow. And after the war, was her contribution to Dutch resistance honored?
Oh, well, after the war, the attack was taught to generations of Dutch school children as an example of bravery. However, neither Frieda nor Willem were mentioned in that, because resistance fighters after the war were portrayed as heroic men, not as women, and of course as heterosexuals. So Frieda was very disappointed at how quickly the sacrifices of the resistance were forgotten, and she eventually moved and emigrated to the United States. During the interview, we talked for 2 days, and Frieda gave me a really incredible gift by sharing her life story with me. She had never spoken openly about her life as a lesbian, but she knew I was gay. and maybe that also helped. And the interview became her legacy. It is today, it's accessible online at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, as is a unique diary, I forgot to mention, donated by Gerd Beck, that tells the story of his first love in Berlin in 1943. So the more we learn about the stories of Frieda, of Willem, of Gerd, the better we understand the power of the individual during the Holocaust. And today, Frieda finally is recognized in the Netherlands as the important figure she always has been.
Well, that's very good to hear. Fascinating. Wow. And so, Klaus, take us back to the history. What happened after? What happened to these men and women, LGBTIQ people, after the Holocaust ended?
After the war, gay survivors were not recognized as victims of the Nazi regime. They were still treated as criminals. Why? In West Germany, the Nazi version of paragraph 175 remained in force until 1969. East Germany returned to the older version of paragraph 175. So in West Germany, the number of gay men in the 1950s and 60s who were convicted were almost as high as in Nazi Germany. So some gay survivors did not survive the second persecution and committed suicide. Others, most, lived in secret or entered fake marriages.
So tragic. It really is. And I mean, Klaus, we could just carry on speaking about this. You come with this decades of experience, and I think, you've already flagged the fact that you were able to hear stories that survivors had not been felt safe enough to speak about, and that so many died alone with their memories. I understand from our conversations that 95% of gay survivors actually never told their stories, and that's just so desperately sad. But I want to ask you,
and they really died alone with their stories. And what for me was most brutal, for them a second trauma, not just the lack of legal recognition, but the lack of empathies, even by their own families. Their families didn't ask a single question about what happened to them. It's very hard to imagine.
Yeah. So now I need to ask you one last question for now. And that when you look back over the 40 years since you've worked on this topic and in this field, what has changed?
Well, growing up gay in Germany in the 1980s, I only learned about the Nazi persecution of homosexuals at university. I was shocked by how little information was there. It was a kind of willful amnesia. Even memorials didn't mention homosexuals as a victim group. And every memorial sign for homosexual victims at former campsites, Tracy, was fought against strong resistance from the authorities. These memorial signs read, "Beaten to death, silenced to death," in memory of the homosexual victims of National Socialism. So it wasn't until the 1990s that LGBT historians began demanding recognition. For gay survivors, this came too late. In my talks with them, it was clear how much it would have meant to them to be recognized for this suffering. It would have meant everything, but they never received that recognition in their lifetime. So in that sense, we all failed them. It took 123 years, but in 1994, paragraph 175 finally was completely removed from the German legal code. So there is a more hopeful side in the story. The culture of remembrance has finally changed. Society has begun to recognize the persecution of homosexuals. And thanks to the hard work of LGBT historians and activists, the men with the pink triangle today are commemorated. Both Germany and Austria have legally recognized the injustice of their persecution. And today there is growing research and documentation, personal stories of victims and survivors, and people are interested. When I started, I didn't expect this kind of support. I'm amazed by how far we come. I even hope that we have learned something from this dark chapter in history where the Nazis decided who was valuable and who deserved to live. But of course, the question is also, have we really, as rising global hatred and authoritarian ideologies challenge democratic norms, and homophobia and transphobia is always part of authoritarianism, extremism, we know that our quest for equality, respect, or empathy will be challenged. But I'm much more hopeful now than I was when I started. And as Joanna and other scholars show, research will continue. Scholars, communities, activists like Gurchaten will explore and memorialize lives we have not yet even heard of. We will find new ways to tell their stories and learn from our painful past. So the silence has been broken. We never will be silent again.
Thank you so much, Klaus. You bring a wealth of knowledge, and also, just the integrity with which you speak is very moving. And we thank you for your time. And you provided a perfect segue to our next speaker, who is Joanna Ostrowska, who also speaks to us from Berlin. And she holds a PhD in humanities from the Jagiellonian University in Krakow in Poland, and is a lecturer in Jewish studies, gender studies, and Polish Jewish studies. In 2020, Joanna won the Mauthausen Memorial Research Award for her work in Polish entitled Unmentioned: Sexual Forced Labor During the Second World War. And her other works include Mein Führer, The Victims of Forced Sterilization in Lower Silesia, 1934 to 1944, and the Polish publication Them, Homosexuals During the Second World War, this has been translated, the book, into German and most recently into Slovak. Joanna has also co-edited the German work Remembering in Auschwitz, also Sexual Minorities. Welcome, Joanna.
Welcome, Tracy. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Oh, it's absolutely our pleasure. And I want to begin by asking you to tell us of some of the challenges that you as an historian and writer have encountered, both in researching and finding out more about this history, and then also about writing and publishing the history.
So first of all, one more time, thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here with you and also talk not only about my work, but about this forgotten history. And I think it will be a gorgeous continuity after what Klaus said before. Because of course, like for me in the beginning, and I started to research this history in 2005, like it was pretty impossible to accept that in my country, in Poland, in 2004, 2005, this amnesia, which was mentioned by Klaus, is still so visible. And I mean amnesia that there is nothing, no sources, no monographs, no books, no texts about this group of victims and survivors, that this is still in Poland, the forgotten group. So this was my main goal, to break the silence and to start to do something. I remember my first dream in 2005. I was sitting in the National Library in Warsaw, and I was thinking and dreaming about the time in which the shelf in the library will be maybe not full, but there will be something there about this history, because it was the lack of publications, not only written by Polish historians, but also lack of translations. So even if you can imagine that a lot of books were published until 2005 around the world about this topic, nothing came to Poland, or nothing was accessible for Polish young generation, older generation. So it was a huge gap of this history, and this was my dream, to fill the gap. But when you ask me about challenges, the first thing which I have in my mind when I started in 2004, 2005, it is the lack of support from the institutions which are actually responsible for commemorating, memorials in former concentration camps, and of course, lack of support from the side of the universities. And for me, it was devastating. You can imagine that, first of all, like the argument was that actually this topic, this people, these biographies, this phenomena, it's not a real history, that we should not research these topics. And I first, like in first moment, I was totally devastated. I didn't know what to do. It wasn't the beginning of 90s or the end of 80s. It was 2005. I was a student studying history, specialization Jewish history and culture. And I couldn't, during the first couple months, I couldn't move because there was no answer from this institution to support me as a young student trying to change something, maybe with big dreams, but trying to make the first step.
Gosh, it is, as you say, it is quite hard to hear you tell us that it was in 2005. You know, that is how long it has taken for, in a way, for this history to begin to be, and Klaus has been working incredibly hard in the field as others, but as you say, it's taken a very long time for this to begin to move into the libraries and into mainstream understanding. Tell me, Joanna, what has been the most significant aspect or fact or something that you have found in your research that you hadn't known about before?
So first of all, when I'm still like thinking about this challenges, because these challenges are really connected with my research and also with all of these things which I assume now as significant. I must mention also that for many historians and many researchers since 2005, like researching this topic, it was like a threat to Polish post-memory. And I think I should mention also that when I started this research, of course, like my first question was like, I was really naive. My first question was also always, why it is not the topic which should be researched? Why you are blocking me? And coming back to the topic, I mean here, like this answers came from the institutions which were and still are responsible for post-memory. And the answer was always complicated, but to make it short, the people responsible in this institution, they answered always that actually this group of people, I mean queer people persecuted during World War II, it was a relatively small group, which means for them, and this was a signal for me, that if it is a relatively small group, we actually should not conduct any research. So when I'm talking about being devastating at the time, this is one of the reasons I didn't know, like being a student, how to even react for this kind of, I would say, really brutal argument. The second answer was always that also in this group of people, queer people persecuted during World War II, the majority, these were the people, German men. So it means that if it is about German men, women were not mentioned, this is not our history, if you know what I mean. So it was even more devastating for me. And the third argument and the third answer why not was that mostly, and this was like the biggest, I would say, cliche, that in many cases, queer people who were persecuted during World War II, who were transported into concentration camps, they were connected with allegation of sexual violence in concentration camps. So it means that they were sexual predators, and definitely, even as researchers, we should not conduct this kind of research. So with these three arguments, with these three answers from the beginning of my work in Poland, I wanted to somehow fight. I wanted to change the situation change this point of view corrupted by all of these cliches and stereotypes. And that's why step by step, I started also to push the agenda of publishing new books, write my own books. So answering with one sentence, what was or still is the most significant in my work, I would say books. But again, the first book in Polish in Poland published about persecution of queer people was published in 2016, and it was for me really important testimony, the first published testimony of so-called the man with the rosa winkel pink triangle, Heinz Hege, a man with pink triangles. And 2016, the date of publication, and Dr. Klaus Mueller was the author of the blurb on the cover. And actually everything started in 2016 with this book, but still I have in my mind that this is really late. And this is like the main difference when we want to compare what has been done in Germany, Austria, the United States, and what has been done in the Eastern Europe, especially in Poland.
Joanna, you're telling us stuff here that just it's extraordinary to hear, and I think just want to thank you again for your dedication and your commitment to making our understanding of what happened during this terrible, terrible period as full as possible, that we understand the implications that hit everywhere. So thank you so much, Joanna. I'm now going to move us to our third speaker and our last speaker for today, and that's Gurchaten Sandhu. And they speak to us from Geneva. Welcome, Gurchaten. Gurchaten is the director. Gurchaten is the director of programs at ILGA World, ILGA being the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans and Intersex Association. They are a widely respected LGBTIQ plus change maker and community leader, and Gurchaten has received numerous awards for their work. Before their time at ILGA World, Gurchaten was the Non-Discrimination Program Officer at the ILO, the International Labour Organization's Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work branch, where they built their expertise and knowledge on promoting social justice through decent and inclusive work for all, in particular to enhance LGBTIQ plus rights at work and economic inclusion. They also served as the president for UN Globe, which is the group representing LGBTIQ plus personnel in the United Nations system. Gurchaten also goes by Nanu, and they've kindly given me permission to call them Nanu. And again, it is my pleasure to have you with us today, Nanu. And I want to begin by asking you what relevance this history that we're discussing today holds for the LGBTIQ plus community. What's the relevance?
Thank you very much, Tracy, for having me, and I apologize slightly for my throat. Still recovering from a mild cold from last week. The question that you hold here is critical, and history, or herstory, as we like to call it, is something that our movement has been built on, and to know history is critical for our movement to not just only survive but also thrive. This history is also in particular key for our movement, because often we think of our movement starting as early as the 60s, or as recently as the 60s and 70s with the Stonewall riots. But what Klaus and the work of Joanna has shown is that no, in fact, our movement building predates Stonewall. We have always been here as a movement. And I think it's really critical to mark that from the beginning. Then I think for us, this relevance is to understand the roots of oppression I mean, as Klaus pointed out, the Nazi era marked one of the darkest periods of history for LGBTIQ plus people, particularly gay men and trans people who were targeted under paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code, where we saw thousands arrested and thousands sent to concentration camps and forced to endure inhumane conditions. And whereas this did not end with the fall of the Nazi regime, but continued for decades after, and many survivors were then re-prisoned post-war as well. We look at the resilience of the individuals who then formed secret support networks. Klaus mentioned the work of Gerhard Beck, and those who survived even within concentration camps and worked covertly to protect others, such as those that Klaus also mentioned. And these acts of defiance were not just about survival, but they were about preserving their identity and humanity against overwhelming odds. So here we're really talking about a recognition of resilience. And these stories strengthens the LGBTI community's understanding of its own resilience and capacity to fight oppression. And so we have seen this before. We have been through this before, and we will go through it again, sadly, right? And we are going through it again, sadly, in parts of the world where we see the rise of the anti-rights movement. And so as a community, we will learn from this and how they have survived, as how our ancestors and transcestors survived through this, but how we will then also thrive and rebuild from this as well. So from this history, has actually shaped modern LGBTIQ plus activism, the pink triangle that Klaus and Joanna also mentioned. And that has been reclaimed as a symbol of resistance and pride. Movements like ACT UP, which drew on this history to fight against the AIDS crisis. Slogans such as silence equals death have been picked up by the HIV and AIDS movement, by other movements, by movements pushing back against current conflicts going on around the world. And this history is important to ensure to preserve and prevent the erasure of LGBTIQ plus histories from mainstream narratives. This is critical. The work of Klaus that they have done is very critical to ensuring that preservation continues and this marginalization ends to the ongoing struggle for recognition. So recent efforts have included Klaus's work, the work that Klaus has also done, and the perspective in Holocaust remembrance, such as memorials, museum exhibits, and scholarly, I can't even the words, academic work, let's just say, that Joanna refers to. So remembering this history is not just about past, but it's shaping the future and ensuring that these voices are heard. But it's also relevant to the current context that we are facing, with over 110 conflicts going on in the world, and how LGBTIQ plus people are particularly vulnerable during these situations, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Afghanistan, whether we've seen the specific targeting in Chechnya right now in Russia, in other parts of the world as well. And therefore, we can learn from this history. So documentation is key, now, and this is how we sort of build our resilience. One of the key things and key activities we do as ILGA World is work with human rights defenders where persecution continues against our identities on how to document these crimes. And we've been able to learn that from the past histories and bring this evidence to the forefront and use it not just for archives and a memory as a preservation, but actually as a form of resistance and as justice for our communities as well. So there, I think it's very important. And I think in terms of going back, just one more point that Klaus mentioned was around the deep roots within genetic purity. We've seen this. Many of this work and this acts of crimes against us, this preservation of society, in particular around eugenics, this sort of ethnic cleansing, it's and this denunciation or perception of homosexuals continues to this very day, where someone perceived of homosexuality is punished. If it was only up until recently where if you were not wearing the right type items of clothing, i.e. what is considered masculine clothing, you could be arrested on the streets. You could be, and this sort of fear and perception of homosexuality as well. We also saw, LGBTIQ plus people, I think perhaps jumping onto the next part, but what we're actually seeing as well is this sort of targeted examples where experiments were conducted on gay men in particular to convert them and to see if conversion therapy can work. And we still see that today. We still see those continued practices. We still see forced sterilization, particularly against our trans siblings across the world who are forced to be sterilized if they want to transition. So this is something that Starks reminds us what this is, where it's deeply rooted in, and that we are still facing this, and how it's spread and used across other countries as well, especially with the rise of the anti-right movements.
Gosh, thank you so much, Nanu, for elucidating so clearly why the past matters, and for the LGBTIQ community today, both in terms of a reminder of the resilience that is there, and that should serve as an inspiration today as we go forward, and to also understand, that this is not the first time that one can recognize, obviously, and understand the differences, as no history is ever identical, but to understand why it is important to be vigilant for these signs. And so thank you so much for doing that. A follow-up question. Why would anyone who doesn't identify as LGBTIQ, why should they care about this history? What has it got to do with them?
Well, this history is our history. Yeah, in my opinion, and this history, or this history, is how we can draw parallels from other persecutions under the Nazi regime. We've seen how, and Klaus and Joanna have talked about how the same machinery was used to oppress LGBTIQ plus people today, and used against Jewish people, against Romani people, Sinti people, people with disabilities, as well as others. And understanding how the system targeted specific groups helps us see the broader dangers of authoritarianism and unchecked prejudice, and how we must work to maintain these sort of balance and checks against of power, and how democracy today, which is under threat in many parts of the world, is integral to this, despite its flaws. We know that democracy is not perfect, but we know that this is the one tool that we must preserve to keep universal human rights applicable to all. And I think this is also key, that there's a universality of human rights that applies to all of us as well. And I think it's also goes back to this idea of oppression that talks about, for example, Nazi ideology talked about those who were deemed degenerate, unfit, and that categorized a span of many groups. And this is deep-rooted in eugenics and a medicalized model. And this continued today, even in today's systems as well. It was only until the late 90s where the WHO pathologized homosexuality. I mean, the word homosexual, as Klaus rightly pointed out, comes from German psychologists, and the word that we, with the pathologization, that we needed to be fixed. And we've seen this throughout history, again, with conversion therapy, but we're not just seeing it with homosexuals. We're seeing this now with our siblings who are intersex. We are seeing this now with our siblings who are trans as well. And these examples of medical experimentation on marginalized groups, including LGBTI individuals, shows how these systems of oppression can harm different populations. We also have a historical responsibility again. I think after the war, after the Second World War, especially after the Holocaust, we said never again. But sadly, we see that we're still not learning from those mistakes, and still crimes against humanity are being carried out across the world, with these 110 conflicts that are ongoing. And then we still see a lack of apology as well. Very few countries have apologized publicly and openly to LGBTIQ plus persons. Canada, UK, the USA, Germany, and I think there are a few others to mention, but very few as well. And so when we talk about the importance of this, it's stronger that we protect the most vulnerable members of our society, and how we must stand up for minorities. I think it goes back to that, that very, very famous quote of Martin Niemöller, and it's been overused. And I'm sorry to those who know this, but first they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out. because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me as well. And this is a stark reminder that, you know, it goes back how united we must be. And I really liked what Klaus talked about, population politics. And this is really what we're facing today. With the rise of the anti-rights movement, we see abortion rights, sexual reproductive health rights, feminist rights, women's rights, all being attacked. And these are the same rights that are being attacked, that are the same as LGBTI rights. It's all comes down to bodily autonomy as well. And so when we see the rise of these laws, we can learn from these lessons, and we can also provide responses today. And that solidarity is key. Now, we've just finished our conference last week, where we had over 1,000, nearly 500 people gather under the banner "Kwa Umoja We Rise," a Swahili word, "Together in Unity We Rise." And this and the conference is a call to action and a reminder to our movements and other movements that now is not the time for division. Now the time is not to be fractured, but really to come together, to unite, to face a common enemy which is growing and has grown marginally, considerably across the world, that threatens our democracies, that threatens our civil liberties, and we must be united to respond to that. And then now more than ever, this is really important to learn from that history. So my thanks to the work that Klaus is doing and Joanna, and I really hope that more and more people pick up our history books and learn from what has happened before, so that we can respond to the same enemy that is still alive very much today. Thank you.
Thank you, Nanu. Those are inspiring words. I think now let us go and have a look at some of the questions that we've received from our audience. And I'm going to, I see that, and thank you to all of you who have written. And please, again, I remind you to, if you have questions or comments you'd like to make, to place them in the Q&A function. And please remember to, I forgot to ask you to say, if you would like, where you are writing from. Haitam Azan has asked, would you provide translation of the meeting into Arabic? Haitam, I wish I could say yes categorically, but we will certainly see what we can do about that. Thank you for your question. Robin, I see your hand, but unfortunately I can't, the way that the meeting is set up, we can't take verbal engagement, and I will ask you, please invite you, won't you put your question or your comment that you have, Robin, into the Q&A. I see that there is a question I'm going to ask. Again, I think, Klaus, maybe this is in your area, Joanna as well. Presently, many laws that criminalize, this is from Sasa Lachik. Sasa, forgive me, I'm sure I've mispronounced your last name, I apologize. Presently, many laws that criminalize same-sex relations also target transgender people. In this context, sexual orientation and gender identity are often conflated. Was this also the case during Nazi rule in Europe, or were transgender people treated differently from gay men and lesbian women? Klaus, Joanna, either of you to same time, go ahead.
Joanna, do you want to start? Or shall I start?
Yeah, I can start because I will be, I think, faster. Thank you so much for this question. And what I would say, I would recommend amazing work of other historians who are really into the topic, especially Kai Brust. You will find in internet an amazing exhibition, online exhibition, only about persecution of transgender people, intersex people during World War II. It is like an amazing new way also to researching sources, to dealing with the topic, to also rewriting research of older historians, etc. So Kai Brust, I recommend it a lot. There are a lot of other researchers, probably I should mention, but to be precise, Kai Brust, please check this name, check this exhibition. It will be the best, from my point of view, it will be the best answer for your question.
Thank you, Joanna. Klaus, before you respond, we will share that the exhibition, online exhibition that you referenced, Joanna, we will, dear audience, we will share that when we share the recording, so you'll be able to follow up. Thank you. Klaus, have you a quick addition that you'd like to make?
Well, thank you, because the question is so head-on. While we have documented very clearly how the Institute for Sexual Science, how important this institute was for groundbreaking research on transgender people, how smartly the Magnus Hirschfeld, who led the institute, negotiated with the Berlin police so that trans people legally could wear the clothes of the so-called other sex, because otherwise you could be arrested. So there's a lot of documentation. We do lack documentation, and I think there's more work to be done. This is one of the areas of research where I think more has to happen. In Germany, to add another researcher, Rainer Haaren has written extensively, and I think but we need more, and we also need more personal stories. We were able to tell one trans story in the film recently, El Dorado, Everything the Nazis Hate. And there you see how surprised we ourselves were about the complexity of the lives between 33 and 45, and how trans people found ways to lead their lives. And we need more of these stories, and I hope this is something that the next generation of researchers also is focusing on.
Tracy, may I say one more sentence?
Of course, please.
Can we see the photo number 3, dear colleagues? It would be, I would be really grateful for your help here. So because of this amazing question, I just wanted to show you also that this is also part of my research, and this is one of these amazing documents which we are still able to find. I'm in the project with Dr. Noah Meunier, connected with transgender network in the 30s in Germany, but also with some situation connected with Eastern Europe. And here you see, this is the party organized in 1933 in Grünberg, today Zielona Góra, and the person who is actually our main protagonist is Georgette. She's sitting in the middle a bit with in this black dress. So we found it couple months ago. This is just the beginning of the research, but I wanted to show you that to also show that there is a lot of possibilities still to research this topic, to change our knowledge, and also to continue this research, especially connected with transgender people, not only with the persecution of these people, but also with their resistance, their life, they attempts to struggle with all of this, with the persecution. And I think this is the best sign to convince you that there is still, what Klaus said before, there's still a lot to do.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joanna, for that intervention. There is a question from Elliot Matz. Elliot asks, how many gay Jewish survivors were there? I would assume extremely few. I wonder if anybody would like to address that.
Very interesting question, because that exchange of information, who of the Jewish survivors were also gay, of course, has not taken place. We know individual stories and can reconstruct them, and you see more and more people are getting interested in this topic. But this is another lack of research to find out what happened to gay Jewish men, to lesbian Jewish women, to trans Jewish people and survivors. How were they experiencing if they survived their life, and did they get support? And I think this is a research that needs to be done, and we only know some personal stories, biographies where that already has been worked on. But thank you for the question. I think that's very important.
And I think to just go back to what you had said earlier, Klaus, if memory serves me right, that what would, in terms of what the Nazis would decide if you were to be both Jewish and gay, if you wish, in the eyes of the Nazis, without creating hierarchies of suffering at all, but the response would be to your Jewish identity. Would that be correct? Right.
Yeah, and to give you an example how that worked in practice. So 2 men in the Netherlands were hunted down by the Dutch police chief, who was responsible to fight vice in Amsterdam. One of them turned out to be Dutch and homosexual, and the other one was also Dutch but Jewish. And so the Jewish man was then given to the Gestapo and immediately sent on transport and killed in a camp very quickly. The Dutchman, who was non-Jewish, went into a different project. So it really is a decisive, the moment that you are discovered to be Jewish, it doesn't really matter anymore that you're gay for your trajectory. And that's mostly that you are deported immediately and killed quickly.
And this is a question from, sorry, I thought somebody was saying, there is a question from Elena, and I think Nanu will ask you and Joanna and Klaus to all weigh in on this. It's a question which is, how can we all help more to raise more awareness on this issue? Now, I'm going to just assume that the issue is about the history, and then possibly also, so forgive me, Alina, I'm reading into your question. This may not be at all what you had intended, but about this history first and foremost, which is what we're trying to do today as well. And then also just to be, raise more awareness of why it matters, why this history matters today.
So to answer really fast, I think of course, like still having this impression that like situation, my situation, the situation in my country is a bit different. So like, again, it's for me, it's a question about dreams. So my biggest dream is that one day for example, museum, memorial, Auschwitz-Birkenau, that there will be something about this group persecuted during World War II. And I think it would be the best tool to make this topic, this history, more visible. And I mean that this is, I think, we live in 2024, 2025 is almost there. And we really need this kind of history, I mean, queer history, not only of persecution, but also of resistance in this kind of institutions in Poland. And what is important here, that this is Museum Auschwitz-Birkenau, so like the impact will be really international. This is one of my biggest dreams. And I'm waiting for that, and I think it would change a lot.
Wonderful. Klaus, would you like to add? And then we'll go to Nanu.
I love this question because it really asks, what can I do as an individual? And you can do a lot. If you visit a memorial, you can just go there and say, I have a specific interest in what happened to queer people. What do you have in your collection? Can you help me if I want to do research? You can get engaged with the Stepping Stone initiative that is happening all across Europe, where individual people are memorialized, replacing a stepping stone in front of their last known address. And the documentation has become so incredibly rich that without that, we would have lost many of these individuals. If you ever, and you can do the same in libraries, and wherever you go, you can simply say, this is a service institution, and this is my question. Are you prepared? Can you help me? And I cannot encourage it enough, because much of our work starts from these individual questions of preserving a letter, of making sure that things are not be throwing away, that maybe are important archival documents. And when I started to work, none of this seemed important and relevant. And I'm now amazed that many of the collections that are brought in are in exhibitions and they matter and people are interested. So just follow your interest and make it very clear to the institutions that need to serve that interest.
Nanu, thank you, Klaus. And Nanu, would you like to add one or two impressions?
Yeah, I've got 3 points here. I think as the global convener of our movement, we bring, all 6 regions or over 2,000 organizations together to convene in a space, and we did that last week, and quite well actually, despite the challenges. And I think what is really important is for the historic part of it is to understand where each one of us is coming from and the historic perspectives we are coming from as well. And where some of the terms some homosexual has come from. It's a term that was coined by someone from outside of our community, and some people and some members and segments of community are reclaiming homosexual, whereas some are reclaiming queer, and there's that sort of difference between the two terminologies, what comes first. But it's really then important to the work that is coming from, or what's coming from this conversation is under history, and it allows us to understand the various perspectives that we bring to the table. So before engaging in conversation, debate, trying to reach consensus, it's really critical to have that historical perspective as well. Number 2, I think it is. I think the part of that is the current application of today's, for today, in terms of documenting human rights violations. And sadly, how can the techniques that we have used throughout to regain, to capture history, to capture that what has happened, how can we apply it to today's documentation? And especially for reporting human rights violations, in particular in the face of judicial or legal systems and policing systems which oppress us as well. What can we then where can we present that evidence, and what evidence is needed? And I think the techniques that historians have is very, very critical to this as well. And I think then it also goes back to the sort of decolonialization of our histories and identities as well, really going back to how queer identities and LGBTIQ plus identities have existed throughout the history of time, and have in some parts of the world, owing to colonialization, have been now wiped out. But how do we reclaim those? Because in those times, in the indigenous practices, history, documenting history was done through other ways, through storytelling, through art, etc., through clothing, through weaving. So how do we reclaim that, and how do we find our histories again? And I hope that this inspires us, because especially with the anti-rights narrative saying, oh, well, this is a Western agenda, and which is actually, sort of the irony is that the Western agenda did actually obliterate some of those histories. How do we refine them, and how do the historians like the work that Klaus is doing, and Joanna are doing, how can we take those practices, or how can we sort of merge those learnings together and form this sort of this thinking around, provide tools for people to really reclaim their history as well. So for us, history is not something that's just happened, it's something that's happening right now as well, and it's very, very critical at this moment and this juncture in time, with with the world in such a turmoil, that we document what is happening, in particular in response to designing better programs. We're the most vulnerable in conflict, times of conflict and crisis, and how do we better respond? And it's only till recently that we've seen humanitarian programs, being actually better designed. And it took us until, I think, Ukraine, the conflict in Ukraine, to actually better provide responses. And I think that was much too late in history to have actually happened. So hopefully we can take from those lessons how we better go forward in designing better humanitarian programs in times of conflict and crisis for our communities. Thank you. But hopefully we won't, and as a prevention method, because, I think enough is enough now in terms of conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, all 3 of you, for very deep and profound answers to that very rich question, as you quite rightly said. There is one more question I want to look at, and that's Alston Chung, who asks about the UN. Does the UN have updated data on how many member countries or territories have legislative laws that protect LGBTIQ plus individuals, or at the very least do not prosecute these minorities? Nanu, perhaps if you can take a minute.
Yeah. In fact, I can answer that because as a former UN international civil servant, I could say that there's no source within the UN that documents that. The actual official source comes from ILGA. The ILGA World is the official authoritative source on the number of countries that document it. And we actually preserve that history. We can go back and look at all of the laws. So if you go to the www.ilga.org and go to our database, you can actually look at the number of countries that criminalize based on sexual orientation and those that provide protections based on sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics. And a little bit of a history lesson here as well. Back in the 80s, we started this work and it was called the Pink Report. Why the Pink Report? Because it was based on the Pink Triangle. Then it became the state-sponsored homophobia report. And now we have laws on us, which includes information on gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics as well. So yes, we're the official source for that figure, which is actually referenced and quoted by the UN and used by a number of UN entities, including the World Bank as well. So a bit of promo there for us. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Nanu. And dear audience, we will be posting a link shortly to the web page that belongs to the UN, which will say a little bit more about what the UN is doing in terms of making sure that everyone, the LGBTIQ individuals are indeed protected from violence, persecution, discrimination, harassment, and stigma. And so I will place that, we will place that in the into the Q&A, and I think you will find some very interesting connections there and the work that the UN system is doing to make sure that no one is left behind. Colleagues, we are drawing to the end of our time together. I want to just draw your attention to lovely responses that we've got from Lutz van Dijk, who is, I know Lutz is from South Africa. I didn't tell him to write this, but he's done also extraordinary work in this field. And he asks a question which we will not answer, but I just want to draw because we don't have time now, but we will send answers. One question related, how can we achieve to get more international attention also to those countries where even the death penalty is still in power against homosexuals while still respecting cultural differences? And that, I think, is a very good question to start an entirely separate panel discussion, and so we will leave that in the air. Another question came through from Radek Sevcik. How could persecution under Nazi Section 175 be carried out from a legal perspective against people who were not German citizens or lived outside Germany? And that is one of those questions where, thank you very much, Radek, we will ask our historians to draft a response and we will make sure that you receive that. There are a few more questions which we will not be able to get to today, I'm afraid, and I do want to take the time that remains just to thank our wonderful speakers for being with us, to thank you, dear audience, for watching, participating today. I know there are a large number who will be watching the recording. And then just once again, it is left to me to have the wonderful privilege to thank Joanna, Nanu, and Klaus for participating today, for the great contribution each of you is making as we move forward in this deeply troubled world of ours. And then just to say to everyone, we will meet you all again, and please keep safe. Thank you and goodbye.